Thank you. Thank you so much. And by the way, the book Women Waging War is out by UVA Press and is just made paperback. So some great contributors to that edited volume. So good morning. And I know that I am between you and lunch, so I've got to behave myself. We are entering the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution and America's founding. You may have heard that this is coming. And indeed, depending on when you say the revolution began, you could say we're already in the midst of it. Indeed, 250 years ago in 1774, American provincials were protesting Britain's intolerable acts and debating their place and roles in the British Empire. Within a year, bloodshed at Lexington and Concord instigated a war. First, a war for rights, and then by 1776 for independence. To win that war, the Continental Army not only had to fight, but to survive. And we acknowledge then the actions and the sacrifices of the soldiers and the officers, but how about those who also served as they followed the army? Indeed, what I'm picking up on is something that I saw yesterday at the museum exhibit with Audubon, and there is a little plaque there about Audubon's unknown collaborators. So I think we should acknowledge the unknown, or at least unacknowledged collaborators with the Continental Army in the midst of the War for Independence. So the followers, what did they do? They certainly contributed to the Army's survival, and indeed, by doing so, to the Army's win. And to do this, what did they do? They ensured that by performing essential services, such as suttling, supplying the forces through the contracting and delivery of food, clothing, and materiel. Services, especially for those who were women, included nursing and housekeeping chores, such as cooking meals, washing clothes, and indeed packing gear over and over and over again. Now, for the sutlers, the contractors, the wagoners, some nurses, and others, that was paid work. But for others, primarily, again, women who were family followers, it was unpaid and personal. Now, I have to say something about the term camp followers, which has often been used and defined pejoratively with a focus on illegal or unregulated followers. This has been coming up in the literature with new generations talking about, they didn't use the term camp followers. It is true. The first one I've been seeing is usually about 1781, using that full term, and it's the British Army in India. But the term followers certainly was used during the American Revolution. What we use it for often is something that became very well known in the 19th century, is to talk about all of these followers, not using the term dependents, which is much more a 20th century term. These, by the Articles of War, retainers to the camp, if you will. So what we're doing, first of all, is to get rid of that idea of prostitution, or to use Artemus Ward's term in 1775, those lewd women around camp. And he brought that out. It was June of 75, the very month that Congress is creating the Continental Army. It is not to be a place for lewd women. So what about the other women? Again, those others, those thousands of women over the course of the 8-year war who belonged to the Army under the Articles of War. In other words, all those persons whatsoever serving with the armies of the United States in the field, though no enlisted soldier, are to be subject to orders according to the rules and discipline of war. So today's chat, I really wanted to talk about 3 of those followers. Women who, though no enlisted soldier, served with, if not in the Army, according to the rules and discipline of war. They packed up they shucked their packs, they took up arms in a few key battles. And by doing so, those actions led to their recognition then and has continued recognition today. So what I want to talk about is what made those 3 women both representative, if you will, of the other followers, as well as exceptional. And those women, you may have heard of them, Margaret Corbin, Mary Ludwig Hayes, later Macaulay, and Anna Maria Lane. Now, the first thing to note of all three is they accompanied their husbands into the Army's camps, where they engaged in some or all of the usual services of followers: the washing, the cooking, the nursing, and the various other tasks. They were already married, and that was essential. Again, it's not supposed to be lewd women. They are legitimate followers with a husband, with a family member in camp. And that they needed to show in order to qualify for rations. So that is one step. The other is usually, if you're qualifying for rations, you're doing some other work as well that makes you then helping sustain that force. Furthermore, the Continental Army accepted followers besides putting them on the ration rolls. If it did so, it expected them to accept its authority. Again, if you're unregulated, you're lewd, you're going to create problems, you're out. Washington and his other officers usually viewed the women as burdens, but they figured as long as they obeyed orders, they could prove useful. And indeed, not just by these tasks. The one that was essential is that some men, if they couldn't have their women or their wives and their families with them, would have left the service to go back home to sustain them, which indeed was a proper role for men in colonial society or the early republic, is to take care of your family. So how do you take care of this burden, this new nation, at the same time you're taking care of the family? Washington would rather have them in the ranks or with them, as opposed to seeing the men leaving the ranks. They are accepted. Now, one of the ways they did try to contain them a bit and their possibility of burdens, especially when they went on campaign. So during the winter months in this early modern era, usually an army would go into quarters, use that time for recruiting, for training, for repairing, for supplying. And during that time, women would join them, including some other temporary followers like, let's say Martha Washington, right? Oh, by the way, what happened to the slide? Just realize it's not up. So anyway, could have pointed out a few things in that slide. So anyway, what are they doing in this? But what they asked is that they do not follow on campaign. So be there temporarily, but especially if you are burdened with younger children, then stay in those camps and let the army march out. But these three women also proved that they didn't all stay in camp, that they did march out. And in this particular case, they were marching out, they were not burdened with children. So again, legitimate family ties, work, and obedience were the keys to followers' acceptance. The Continental Army accommodated them because of the services and the stability that they provided. Yet even though they did these important tasks, such followers were generally forgotten, except for those who stepped out of line to fight the enemy. Margaret Corbin, who is the Captain Molly of Fort Washington fame, Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay, supposedly the Molly Pitcher of Monmouth, and Anna Maria Lane at Germantown and elsewhere. So give you a little bit of background where they fit. Margaret Corbin, and indeed, by looking at them, I'm doing history more from the bottom up than the great man from the from the top down. She appears to have been born around 1751, very common age for those who served in the military, the soldiers. She was born in Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, to a family of Robert Cochrane, a Scots-Irish settler who was killed in the French and Indian War. She married John Corbin, who had come up from Virginia. He had enlisted in Thomas Proctor's artillery regiment for what was the Pennsylvania State and then Continental Line. So here's how she's coming in, following him. Now, a 1926 author noted that she had endeared herself to her husband's comrades by the exercise of various womanly virtues, tending the sick and wounded, carrying water to them during an engagement, we'll come back to that, or cooking and mending during periods of ease. Excuse me, how is cooking and mending periods of ease? in all of this as he's pointing this out. But of course, what that 1926 author was trying to do is set her up as this virtuous kind of middle-class woman who could serve as a model for those reading about her. That she's an acceptable model because she has womanly virtues, and she's not one of those lewd women with the camp in there. The trouble is womanly virtues did not make her memorable. What did were her actions at Fort Washington on the 16th of November, 1776. So Fort Washington is north of New York City. It's on the Hudson, we're up into the Hudson, on the Hudson River, one of the avenues into the hinterlands of New York. And the Continental Army had been pushed back through that campaign, trying to hold on to Fort Washington. It's being set up there, and part of Proctor's artillery was sent to reinforce the camp there. That included then Corbin's husband in that detachment, and she went with him. They fired on the Hessians that were coming up the hill to try to take Fort Washington. He fell. Other gunners fell. Margaret Corbin stepped up and manned the artillery piece, firing grape shot onto those Hessians as they're moving up. It was heavy fire, and in the midst of it, she in turn was hit. She took fire from the Hessian guns, and indeed a severe wound from grape shot in her shoulder nearly severed her left arm, along with lacerations to her left breast and jaw, which finally took her out of the action. She was taken prisoner, but soon returned. So here's how we start to get more of her story. She somehow made it back to Pennsylvania, and on the 29th of June, 1779, with the minutes of the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania, they made some orders in favor of Margaret Corbin. First, she was to be given $30 to relieve her present necessities, she having been wounded and utterly disabled by 3 grape shot, while she filled with distinguished bravery the post of her husband, who was killed by her side. They furthermore ordered, given that she be recommended, for further consideration by the Board of War. So they kicked her story up to Congress. The reason being, they figured, the Pennsylvania Council did, that notwithstanding the ration and the help that they gave her, she is not provided for as her helpless situation really requires. The Board of War, in turn, did commend her fortitude and virtue and said she was as entitled to the same grateful return which is made to a soldier in circumstances equally unfortunate. Indeed, on the 6th of July, 1779, Congress resolved that she was to receive during her natural life or the continuance of said disability, 1/2 the monthly pay drawn by a soldier in the service of these states. And that was a common disability funding during the war. She also was given a complete set of clothes, and I keep going, soldiers' clothes, women's clothes, where are we going within all of this? Congress, by the way, the Board of War, followed up on this in July of 1780, having received word that Margaret Corbin was still remaining in a deplorable state. And by that time, by the way, she was following with the Invalid Corps. So she didn't have a husband, but she was allowed to continue with the Invalid Corps, which was a corps of disabled soldiers who still could serve somewhat for the Continental Army. And indeed, they were sent up to West Point to continue to man that when the rest of the Continental Army was moving down through New Jersey in the Yorktown campaign in 1781. So she is up there at West Point. But she was given then continued ability to stay with it. Furthermore, since she was still in deplorable situation, she was deprived of the use of one arm and is in other respects much disabled and will probably continue a cripple for the rest of her life. So again, pointing out that women too had the wounds of war. Soldiers certainly were, but some of these followers also suffered wounds. They suffered diseases, and in some cases died in regimental hospitals from those diseases or in childbirth as they were with the Army. So to see that other side of this war. After the war, by the way, the Commissary of Military Supplies maintained Corbin at West Point, where she was known as Captain Molly, until she died about January of 1800. So she's one. To follow up very quickly then on the others is Mary Ludwig Hayes, Molly Pitcher. How do we get Molly Pitcher? First of all, you could probably thank the citizens of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, who had been hearing the stories of this local woman and decided that they would honor her and present her petition. There would have been a statue, a picture of the statue in Carlisle up here to present how they were doing this. Here's her story, and she became, if you will, or her story is the basis of Molly Pitcher. Though I like to argue Molly Pitcher really as a term like camp followers encompasses quite a few, thousands more women than just one in this case. But Mary Ludwig Hayes had followed either John Casper Hayes or William Hayes out of Carlisle to Proctor's Artillery, the same one that Margaret Corbin had been with. Have seen no evidence that the two women knew each other, but they were with the artillery, and as followers, as doing their jobs during normal situations, they would have been learning the artillery drill. They might have been taking buckets up and down. What are those buckets of water for during training and in war? It's not necessarily for the men to drink, but to swab out the guns. So here they are right in the midst of this. And indeed, in the Battle of Monmouth then, as we're looking at this is 28 June 1778, we've got this evidence that somewhere there on the artillery base, a man fell at his gun and a woman stepped in to man it. Now that woman isn't named in that account. And one of the best accounts is Joseph Plum Martin's memoirs of that war, and he noticed this woman doing this, and indeed noticed that a cannonball went between her legs. And supposedly she kind of looked down. It was a good thing it didn't go any higher. And continued to do her work. Now, the other probably apocryphal story is that Washington afterwards commended her and promoted her. Well, she's not enlisted in the first place, so here's where we get the stories. But she started calling herself Sergeant Molly. Okay, so we have Captain Molly, we have Sergeant Molly with the artillery of women who were able to fire artillery pieces. So it's not unusual that women are in the artillery now. They could do it in the Continental Army, they can certainly do it now. All right. Well, indeed, after the war, her husband eventually did die. She married another by the name of Macaulay. He deserted her, and she ended her life then as a domestic servant. So both of these heroines, if you will, of the war end up in very distressed circumstances after the war. And in 1822, Pennsylvania awarded her not a widow's pension, but $40 per year for her own unspecified services in the war. And she died in 1832. So she had gotten a Pennsylvania pension, if you will, for this. The last one I wanted to mention briefly, Anna Maria Lane, native of Connecticut, followed her husband John Lane, who was in the infantry, regiment of foot, so not artillery, had been in multiple battles with him. She is noted for the Battle of Germantown, where supposedly, in the garb of a soldier, she took part in the actions of Germantown, and indeed was wounded severely in the leg, but nevertheless stayed with the army, stayed with her husband throughout the rest of the war, besides this, okay? So after the war, John and Anna Lane lived in Virginia. He ultimately was with the Guard, the public guard, and she volunteered at a military hospital. By 1807, she was so disabled, so weak, she couldn't work. And indeed, the governor of Virginia at that time then requested the General Assembly to recognize her efforts through the war and beyond with some kind of compensation. She was indeed commended for her bravery and extraordinary services. In 1808, the Virginia Assembly granted Lane a pension of $100 a year, which is an extraordinary amount beyond what they were giving the soldiers at that time. Why? Because she, in the Revolutionary War, in the garb and with the courage of a soldier, performed extraordinary military services and received a severe wound at the Battle of Germantown. She's being recognized for that. Now, the question remains, and we're still kind of working this way through, was she fully garbed as a soldier? Kind of like Deborah Sampson, who had enlisted as Robert Shirtliff. If so, she wouldn't have been enlisted under her name. Can we find any evidence she was enlisted under another soldier's name, a male name? That has not yet popped up. But if she was somewhat in the garb of a soldier, that meant her comrades knew that she was a woman taking up arms in this situation. Did she always take up arms? Did she drill with them? Or is it that at the Battle of Germantown, as men fell around her, she picked up a gun and was able to fire it? Many women knew how to fire weapons on the farms in the States, so she's more a country person rather than a city person. But with the courage of a soldier, she performed extraordinary military services. So what I do with these three women is, first of all, we know her names. And for most of these thousands of women who followed the Army, we don't have their names. We get some of them out of pension records later on, but we don't have them all. And that's part of the problem with women's history, is we don't always have their names. When we do, we bet we're trying to follow their stories. But the other one is that we should be, as we are moving into this 250th anniversary of the founding of the nation, the beginnings of the U.S. Army, moving through the Revolutionary period, remember the women's roles within it, and understanding that they too acted with the courage of a soldier. Thank you.
Thank you. That was lovely. Questions? Do we have?
So, nobody has questions about women in the Revolution because you want lunch. Let me tell you, that's what they were involved in, helping make sure everybody was well supplied in this.
Well, there's a question.
Oh, beautiful.
Where was it?
Hi, back here. My name's Joe Solar, Philadelphia. As I was listening to you talk about women in the Continental Army side, I couldn't help but think about the runaways from slavery who served along on the British side. And if you're struggling to find the American side of the followers, is there any hope of reclaiming any of these stories of these men and women who ran away from slavery to serve with the British and provided all of those services you were describing?
Very good. We do know that we have runaways within the American Army that were also Black. We have some of them who were certainly still enslaved. So I did not get into that part of the enslaved followers with the Continental Army. In terms of the British Army, you certainly do have runaways with them. One of the great records for that is the Book of Negroes, is that as the British Army was leaving New York City at the end of the war by 1783, that they were taking some of the runaways with them. And that includes some women's names who had run away to the forces, and many then of those Black runaways served with the British forces. So the men may be entering into it, the women acting in service support roles. So yes, fortunately we are getting some of the names. Again, we do not have all of them.
Are there more questions down here?
There is the-
Yes, up there, another one in the balcony. Good.
Michael McCormick, I have an idea for how one might be able to give voice to the voiceless women who served, particularly those involved in combat. It's become possible to identify through careful bioarchaeological analysis of skeletal material individuals, for example, who served in the Roman army. From cemeteries of the period, And it's entirely plausible that in the cemeteries of the early Revolutionary and Federal period, that there are women who have combat wounds that can be identified as being typical of a military service, which could be combined with other indications, including indications of particular types of stress in their physical activity and their diet and illnesses at particular times in their lives that might help you to build your source base of individuals who are involved in combat in this period, who can be definitively identified through genetic evidence as female.
Thank you. Yes. The only other stuff that we have been getting into is this was more of the 7 Years' War of the French and Indian War. Fort Ligonier, through archaeological evidence, had picked up a lot of women's shoes at the fort. So we do get material artifacts. There have been other archaeology done at some of the forts, certainly in New York, that was uncovering, again, like buttons and shoes, and including children's items. It's, again, giving us evidence of many of the unknown that were with it. So you bet that the archaeology helps with this. The other thing I just really wanted to point out, it wasn't here, I really just say it, that recently, as people have been looking at some of the watercolors and sketches of soldiers, have been seeing a little bit more of these little items that are showing women with the Army. Women on the wagons, which they weren't supposed to do. They were constantly ordered off. Great one from Library of Congress that shows the Army at West Point in 1782. And lo and behold, right up front, there is an image of a woman with soldiers with cooking and two girls. So we're getting some of the physical evidence besides in the pension accounts and in the orders that are showing the women there. Good stuff.
Great. Question here.
Rich Schifrin, Indiana. Are there any better records of women serving in the armed forces after 1776?
They do get a bit better. And of course, one of the things that is unfortunate for studying the Continental Army is so many of the Army records were burned up in D.C. in the early 1800s. So we've lost some of the records, which might have appeared more. Certainly in the Civil War, we're getting a bit more evidence of the women who followed, especially the evidence of those who were with Clara Barton and the other service or nursing service support. By the time we're getting into the 20th century, we are starting to officially get women into the forces rather than simply with them, and thus we get the records for them. Yeah.
So we're out of time for questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I have two further thank yous and some announcements. First of all,